everybody. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media Warren Frey, and with me today I have
Don Wall, Daily Commercial News in Ontario.
Angela Gismondi, I'm staff writer with the Daily Commercial News, also in Ontario.
And Evan Saunders with the Journal of Commerce, located in Vancouver.
And we're all here because the federal budget happened on Tuesday, and we have a whole bunch. You guys have all done a bunch of sort of summing up from different stakeholders what they think of the budget, and the verdict is mixed is a nice way to put it. Maybe a less nice way to put it is they aren't thrilled. So Don, why don't you start with that? You talked to a fair number of people in Ontario who weren't blown away, although a few of them saw cause for optimism.
Yeah. Actually, I was talking to national stakeholders. And, so the first couple of people I talked to, so in broad strokes, the green technology and energy credits looked like a major new direction, billions spent in the construction sector. The engineers said construction sector will be involved in new plants and electricity, grids and SMR, reactors, hydrogen plants, all that stuff. But it turns out that seems like a whole new industrial strategy, but some of our stakeholders said it's not really all encompassing. It's focused on some certain areas, but there's a lot else of other stuff under the sun. So the electricity tax credit, clean technology manufacturing and investment tax credit, clean hydrogen tax credit, to be specific. So those are all great. Somebody said, yeah, great, but what about us? I spoke to gentlemen from the kind of the Green Building Council, and they said, they're heavily involved in retrofits of kind of, hundreds of thousands of aging buildings. That's a major source of carbon emissions. So there's no money for retrofits, for materials, or for so that was one. That was he had some specifics. Now, Mary Van Buren, I talked to her of the Canadian Construction Association. They had 6 priorities, and basically none of them were met. So so she, being diplomatic, talked about, I think 3 stakeholders actually mentioned the absence of any reference to the National Infrastructure Assessment Plan. That was introduced in 2021. No action on that since. The engineers and the CAA has been talking about that. When are we going to get that? Because as you've noticed, so the National Infrastructure Plan, that was launched in 2016, 10-year plan, $180 billion. It looked like it'll go on forever. Well, we're in 2023. We're approaching the end of that. There's wording that will be revisited and a new vision will be launched. But people said, where's the vision? The mechanical engineer said, we were left out. Whereas, we'll be involved in the new directions, green energy, green production, but the pathway to get there, we were not mentioned. So a lot of people are identifying what wasn't in the budget, and there's. I think you've got a clip of Mary talking about that.
Yep,
She likes the green direction, but there are major gaps.
And here's that clip that Don just mentioned of Mary.
Probably 3 areas in particular that are missing, which is a long-term infrastructure plan. Like you said, we've talked about this. 65% of our economy comes from trade. And there's been very little to no recognition of the necessity of investing and bringing our trade-enabling infrastructure, up to world-class standards. And there was no advancement on the National Infrastructure Assessment announced in 2019. And those are both essential to Canada's economy.
They're kind of just putting those on the
go ahead.
They're putting those on the back burner for now. Somehow, I know they're reevaluating infrastructure needs, and the 12-year, 10-year plan is due to be reshaped. But that would be you're saying that's a top priority, and they're saying yeah, we'll get to it or something.
Exactly, and we know as a country we need strong infrastructure, and we know that other countries are investing, and Canada continues to fall behind. So yeah, that's a significant miss in our minds to support the economy in the long term. The second is the workforce. There was very little initiative to recognize the whole need for immigration to be overhauled, so that we can attract and retain a workforce that is skilled and contributing to the economy. And then the third area would be fairness. The green incentives are fantastic, and we support helping businesses transition to a green economy. But those incentives need to be available to all businesses.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you don't see it's like, a direction of the green economy and its tax credits. So it's only available to it. Well, it seems like it's a bold new vision. It's in reality kind of narrow. I spoke to somebody from the Canada Green Building Council, obviously, and they say, there's nothing in there for like the nuts and bolts of green building. Like where are our incentives and tax credits? So it's while it looks broad and like a new vision, you're saying, it's not what it seems to be, or it's not that broad.
Yeah, and if you look at what the green incentives are, they're tying it to certain labor conditions, and we know that the workforce is already strained. So if a priority is to help Canadian businesses be leaders in green, then incentives should be open to all Canadian companies.
So, Don, it wasn't all negative. You talked to Canada Building Trades Union Executive Director Sean Strickland, and you said he had some okay things to say about the budget.
Yeah, you know what? He said it was a historic day for workers in Canada yesterday. Tied in with all those clean electricity, investment tax credit, and others was, he said, it was all labor-led. There's major prevailing wage pledge in there that requires union scale compensation, including benefits and pension contributions. So all the work that's going to be done with all those billions that'll be spent, it'll all be union workers, and the wages will be union scale compensation tied in with the prevailing collective agreements. We all know those. In the past year, they some significant increases over 3% per year over 3 years. So people, I think the CAA made a reference to that, saying that that's kind of some limitations to that. But anyway, Sean Strickland, historic day for workers in Canada. They're very pleased. Mm-hmm. So I think you've got a clip of him, don't you?
We do have a clip, so we'll run that one next.
I saw how busy you were prior to the budget, holding meetings and advocating on some of these points. So, there must be some satisfaction that some of your concerns were being listened to.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. It's a historic day for workers in Canada yesterday, as all workers, union and non-union, prepare to build the new economy of the future, and the government has listened, and not only have they listened, they put it down on paper. The prevailing wage, to be eligible for tax credits, you have to pay prevailing wage, and also apprenticeship requirements, which will ensure that we're creating good middle class jobs with pensions and benefits, and we're also paving the way for the next generation of tradespeople in this country. And so, if you want to get that higher tax credit, you got to comply with those labor and apprenticeship requirements, and that is absolutely historic for Canadian workers, and we're really pleased with yesterday's budget.
Yeah. Was that something that was, directly mentioned, a good mechanism to ensure that, across the table kind of thing, or memos, obviously, something you identified, you asked for?
Yeah, we've been advocating for this prevailing wage definition, for quite some time as an industry and as a union movement. And with this budget, we saw an opportunity, and and a good case to the federal government that, look, if you're going to provide tax incentives that are, whatever the number is, tens of billions of dollars to private sector industry to decarbonize our economy, you better make sure that the quid pro quo was good middle class paying jobs. Yeah. And so that argument, carried the day. Mm-hmm. And the government recognizes that. So, in exchange for tax credits, proponents for the new energy sources of the future, many of which are highly capitalized private sector companies, are going to have to ensure they have the highest labor standards that are available in the market. And that's good for workers, it's good for Canada, and it's good for the green economy.
Yeah. And, aggressively pursuing the green economy, not saying, oh, well, we'll rely on the private sector, or we'll hope that comes through to provide the green jobs, and in a transition for your members, so that there is progress in significant investment in that transition. So that sounds good to you as well, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. There's all kinds of other things, in addition to the tax credits and labor requirements, which we're very, very pleased with. There's also earlier this year, the Sustainable Jobs report was tabled, the Just Transition legislation tabled probably in the fall session, and the Sustainable Jobs approach just talks about, tens of millions of dollars for training to help workers transition to help construct and fabricate and maintain and deliver these new energy sources of the future. So there's money in there for transition and for training. We're looking at potentially more dollars for the Union Training Innovation Program. And one of the keys to all of these initiatives is being labor-led. So labor is at the table, and we have to work hand-in-hand with industry. No doubt about it, but it's being labor-led, and labor's at the table because it's our workers and workers right across Canada who are going to, be most affected by this transition in the economy. And I can't overstate it, and I've said it countless times. This movement to decarbonize our economy and get to net zero carbon by 2050 is the largest transformation of our economy since the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. This is a heavy lift, and we need to do it. We need to do it for all the right reasons, for our economy, for industrial policy, to stop the warming of the planet and make sure that we protect the planet and humankind for generations to come. And our role in this is that we want to make sure we're at the table, we're having discussions, and that no worker, no Canadian gets left behind.
And so, Angela, you talked to Richard Lyall, the president of the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, and he wasn't thrilled with how little there was about housing after, well, A, an ongoing affordable housing crisis, and B, I think they talked a fair bit about it last time on the budget, but this time he didn't hear all that much, and he had a few things to say about that.
Right. Yeah. And I think that was echoed with all the construction industry stakeholders that I spoke to, saying there are some positive things in the budget, but ultimately, they used terms like fell short, missed the mark, it was disappointing. And Richard actually said it was out of touch with what Canadians need right now, which is housing. So not a lot in the budget for what our industry is interested in. So infrastructure, labor, housing, immigration, nothing for municipalities. And the things that were mentioned were either from previous budget or just reiterating the federal government's commitment. So some of the positives that they indicated were, as Don mentioned, the clean technology, clean electricity, clean hydrogen investment tax credits. And additional details were also announced on the labor requirements and apprenticeships that are tied to those projects. So that was a positive thing for some of our industry members, especially on the labor side. And also included in the budget was the doubling of the maximum employment deduction for tradespeople's tools expenses. So that went from $500 to $1,000. And then some of the concerns on the other side, with all these infrastructure projects that the feds have planned, our sources are asking, where are the workers to build these projects going to come from?
Mhm.
And what's the government doing to allow the construction industry to get more skilled workers through immigration? So that, they said, was details on that were lacking in the budget on how to do that. Something else that was worrisome was the level of federal debt, especially when it's coupled with provincial debt and what that means for the economy going forward. And another concern was the absence of dedicated funding to help cities with cost of state of good repair projects, because
Mhm.
municipalities are still, feeling the impacts from COVID-19 pandemic on municipal budgets. And so they're saying that it could lead to municipalities being forced to decrease their infrastructure projects. And, leading off of that is workers being laid off. And then just going back to Richard Lyall for housing, basically said there's measures in the budget that are going to help young people enter the housing market. But it doesn't address the root of the problem. And that's really, increasing housing supply across the countries. So he said there were measures on the demand side, but not on the supply side. And that's where the real issue is. And we have a clip from him.
Yep,
And
we do.
here it is.
Yeah, the federal budget. So they got this thing. We're in the middle. We've got a housing crisis. And the only thing in the budget is really is $8,000 a year, 40,000 savings, which is a demand side measure. Okay, it's nice, it's good. But what it is that it doesn't really help do anything on supply, which is where the problem is. And then the people that are really hurting from housing and the ones who can barely pay the rent aren't really going to be able to save up $8,000 a year. And so I just found it was kind of, okay, it's nice and everything, but it's not dealing with the crisis, not the problem, but the crisis. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that we do know is the federal government is pulling in billions of dollars a year in taxes from new housing. The CMHC has said their number was even higher than the provincial 1.5 million target. Their number is really 1.8 million or 3.5 million nationally. Mm-hmm. And the recent program, the Housing Accelerator Fund, okay, that's nice. It's 100,000 units over how many years? Because you never know how quickly these things roll out, and usually they don't. Mm-hmm. But meanwhile, CMHC is saying we need 3.5 million. So, the feds are profiting enormously from taxation on new housing, and they're not putting it back into infrastructure, and they're not putting it back into housing projects. And, the big thing that sticks out for me in all this is, where was the discussion or anything with, other levels of government, or looking at, what was that incredibly successful program back in the 60s and 70s that worked through the CMHC and the tax system with developers, where we built tens of thousands of units of nice, large, purpose-built rental apartments that still formed 80% of our stock of purpose-built rental housing today. Mm-hmm. Was there, and the interesting thing about that is, if you go back and you say, some people are saying, well, 1.5 million is not possible, 1.8, forget it, right? Mm-hmm. Well, if you actually look at the record and you look at the chart showing the actual construction activity, the starts of all these units, or the actual amount of units that were produced in the 60s and 70s, it went right off the page. I mean, it was just spectacular. Mm-hmm. And we did it. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know where we'd be without that housing. And we need purpose-built rental housing, especially in a modern gig economy, because you theoretically, get higher labor mobility now and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so it facilitates that. We already know there are problems with companies looking to come to Toronto, or people trying to attract people to come to Toronto. It ain't working now. In fact, we're exporting people. The population's actually starting to fall. This is Canada's engine of growth. And we're seeing it in other areas. Just look at the TTC problems, commercial real estate in downtown Toronto. Mm-hmm. We've got people. You need the number is now an income of $240,000 a year to buy a place in Toronto. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, are these people? I'm kind of like, if this isn't a crisis, then I don't know what the hell a crisis is. And the fact that they are jumping the budget deficit massively, the only reason that should be happening right now, given these uncertain economic times, is some massive housing measure that would see, something like a massive increase in, purpose-built rental housing, a reduction in taxes in housing. I mean, taxes in housing are so high, it's stupid. I mean, we're starting to tax housing like a sin tax. It's 30%.
Yeah.
Taxes, fees, and levies on new housing. Housing's a need. I mean, we should be taxing it like food, not tobacco. Mm-hmm. So I am completely. It's actually outrageous. Okay. It's outrageous because, and I think that it kind of, at best, it speaks to the people in power being totally out of touch with the reality on the streets relative to housing and all that stuff, and homelessness, and how the feds are, they say, they accuse the development industry of profits. I mean, we know that what margins are there, or profits are there in housing, actually don't even really justify the risk of being in the business and producing housing. Yet some people do it because, well, that's what they know how to do. But the real profiteers in housing, it's the federal government. What adds insult to injury, on top of this, and you can quote me on this too, insult to injury is the immigration numbers. So when the province, and I've got a unique perspective on some of this stuff by virtue of the position I hold in the industry, and I get to see the information and connect the dots. The province comes out with its task force report, 1.5 million units, right? Almost an impossible task. It is possible, but man, we got a big job, right? Huge. Right. Hugely ambitious, right? But needed because of what? The demographics, and demographics don't lie. So that's 1.5 million. What happens after that? The feds, without really any explanation, increase the immigration numbers even higher. So it's really 1.8 million, 8.5 million, or whatever the number is, right? Mm-hmm. They increase the numbers higher. Where's the housing programs? It gets mind-boggling. We already had a crisis, and they increased the numbers higher, and there isn't a peep about it. And there's nothing in the budget to deal with it. There's nothing on the supply side here. Right. They got their housing accelerator fund, which is 100,000 units over, the next millennia. Right. When their own agency, the CMHC, is saying we need to build 3.5 million homes in the next 8 years. Somebody can't add in Ottawa.
And so, Evan, you got the Western side of things. Who did you talk to?
Absolutely. Well, I spoke to a number of Western stakeholders, and generally what I heard from them was a general enthusiasm around green investments, at least to the extent that nobody said they disagreed with them. They weren't necessarily seen as a party favor. But there was a lot of disappointment that the budget didn't go far enough around important issues like easing immigration for people with skilled trades, as Angela said, barely any mention of housing investments while we're in the middle of a housing crisis, and a lack of actionable items on trade corridors, supply chains, and national infrastructure. So we'll jump down to Matt MacInnis, who I spoke with. He's the president of the Electrical Contractors Association of BC. And there's a lot of investment in electricity in this budget, but for Matt, it was kind of it wasn't so exciting because he expressed some worry that it would be difficult to access in BC to actually do smaller projects. He spoke very highly of BC Hydro and the huge hydro projects that BC has, like Site C, but he noted there needs to be more smaller supplementary energy projects, and that it can be difficult to make those happen out here, let alone to secure the funding. So he expressed a general hope that a framework would be put in place by the provincial government to make it easier to do things like solar farms, wind farms, run-of-the-river projects, things that are in between the scale of something like Site C, because you don't have 10 years to build capacity every time you need more energy. We can run a clip from Matt here.
The investments which the federal government is making into the electricity grid are certainly interesting, and if it helps to incentivize the development of both new generation and transmission infrastructure here in BC, that's going to be a net positive for both our members here at ECABC and also for the province in terms of its ability to accomplish the goals of Clean BC and its electrification policies. One of the things that we've expressed some concern over is whether or not British Columbia is doing all of the in-depth work it needs to do in order to achieve those electrification goals, and hopefully these will help to move the dial on some of the infrastructure that is required.
Yeah, and do you think, with a lot of the new funding that's opening up, I'm looking at $20 billion in Canada Infrastructure Bank to support clean electricity and clean growth infrastructure. Does that feel positive to you that money actually may be able to make it to BC and be used in meaningful projects?
I mean, you never want to immediately default to the Western alienation card, but certainly, Western Canada is always going to wonder if funding from the federal government is going to be appropriately spread across the country, or if it'll be focused in central Canada or other regions. So while that is a question, one other important contributing component to this is British Columbia will need to make some adjustments to its recent policy if BC firms or firms operating in BC are going to be able to take advantage of those dollars. It's been a number of years since there's been investment in new electricity generation projects in British Columbia that are outside of the purview of Site C or other major infrastructure within BC Hydro. So a big question right now is going to be whether or not the BC government decides to enable new electricity projects to be built and constructed and potentially owned by other clean energy producers outside of BC Hydro or not.
Yeah, interesting. I actually hadn't heard about that. So you're finding, generally speaking, that new electricity projects are really focused on those extremely major projects, like obviously Site C is one of the biggest projects in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it's been more than 5 years, and I don't have the exact number on me, but it has been more than 5 years since BC Hydro has had an active call for private power projects, other than very small isolated projects to support, for example, communities getting off of diesel or other generator projects. So historically in British Columbia, we've had a pretty robust independent power stream of projects, particularly between sort of 2008 and 2015 area. But the current government's policies have been to restrict that. So we'll see if the government makes any adjustments to those policies to enable new projects to come online within BC's energy supply or not.
And new diverse projects, right? I mean, do you get any fear at all that you're seeing all this funding that the provincial government will just direct it towards these kind of mega BC hydro projects then, and it won't really be able to be diversified?
any electricity grid needs to have a diversified mix of projects. And certainly one of the great advantages British Columbia has historically had is the affordable, clean, firm power which BC Hydro's large dams produce. That is without question the backbone of our electricity system. Mm-hmm. But there's also an important place I believe, for intermittent, clean, renewable projects, whether it be run of river or solar or wind. And hopefully we'll see some of those types of projects be enabled and be supported by the new funding that the federal government brought forward. One thing we know is that British Columbia is going to need more electricity if we're going to achieve the province's electrification and GHG reduction targets. If you're going to add an enormous amount of new electric vehicles to British Columbia, if you're going to fully electrify industrial projects, whether it be LNG or mines or anything else, we need more generation capacity, and hopefully we'll see the province move forward with those projects.
So just to kind of clarify that for myself too, there's kind of an aspect where, if we're going to be expanding, you need to enable some smaller projects instead of just relying on 10, 15-year long projects to build massive dams.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that's a logical approach. If we look at bringing on an enormous number of electric vehicles into our grid over the next 10 years, and we already know that most of the new power that Site C will provide is likely to be consumed by existing projects such as LNG Canada and other pieces. The reality is you're not going to build a new major dam in British Columbia in the next 8 to 10 years. It's simply not going to happen.
For sure. So we need to see some policy framework or some shift from the provincial government to also support that, to enable that funding to reach those smaller projects.
Certainly, and I think that British Columbians are open to the idea of having new solar projects or wind farms or run-of-river projects being built to supplement and complement the incredible firm power which BC Hydro is able to provide.
And you also talked to Chris Lorenc of the Manitoba Heavy Construction Association. He always has things to say about infrastructure. So what did he have to say this time?
Absolutely. Well, let's start with one of the first things I mentioned, which was the problems around trade corridor supply chains and national infrastructure, which was really what Chris was talking about. And he really nailed that narrative. There was talk in the budget about investing in trade corridors and national infrastructure, notably the intent to create a national supply chain strategy that would have a focus on trade corridors. That sounds great, but that's all it was. It was just words. There was no dollars set aside to actually make this happen. There's no task force underway. There was just a mention that this would begin this year, but will it? I think some stakeholders were hoping to see a harder commitment on that front, whether that be the actual immediate creation of a group to oversee the creation of a supply chain strategy, or at least some money that they could be held accountable to for spending on the creation of this. Chris from the Manitoba Heavy Construction Industry was optimistic that it could happen this year. He called himself an eternal optimist, or that it would at least begin this year. But he really emphasized the importance of Canada as a trading partner in the world, that more than 60% of our economy is trade-based, and that we need to invest in our supply chain and trade corridors to capitalize on that, or we risk falling further and further behind. To that point, too, you can be a great trading partner in green tech, in green minerals for electric cars and solar machines, in wood, in green resources. It doesn't have to be shipping the resources of days gone by. But we need the infrastructure to make those happen, and we can roll Chris talking about that here.
I found in the budget documents a glimmer of hope and appreciation that perhaps budget 24-25 will usher in a priority on investment in economic growth, because there is reference to strengthening Canada's trade corridors. And although there's Zippo nada money in for 23-24 other than to respond to disruptions, there is reference to in the document that commits the federal government to working with the private sector and levels of government to ensure that there is a long-term plan developed for Canada's transportation infrastructure to better coordinate investments to support future trade. And from my perspective, that is the single most certain area of investment that the federal government, partnering with provincial and municipal governments and the private sector, can make to grow the economy. We are a trading nation. Fuels, fossil, and food are the three areas of export that we are very strong in which we can help provide the world, in which we can be a provider. Critical minerals, I'm glad to see, got attention. That is another area of clearly emerging importance. But the reality is that if we don't pay attention to the fact that trade generates 65% of our GDP, if we don't respond to a significantly fallen reputation as a reliable trading partner, as seen through the eyes of the world, our competitors and our partners, and here I'm referencing Canada was 9th in 2009 in its rating as a reliable trading partner, and according to that same analysis, by 2019 we fell to 32nd, ahead of Azerbaijan. And worse, or to further complicate that perilous drop, we are not seen as a jurisdiction in which the country has the ability to build major infrastructure assets. If we don't address those two things yesterday, we potentially wake up tomorrow morning watching the world pass us by, watch friendshoring assist competitor liberal democracies, and we being left in the dust. And I think Perrin Beatty from the Canadian Chamber a number of years ago put it best. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, there's the infrastructure we want, like parks and splash pads and recreation. There's the infrastructure we need, like healthcare and education. But then there's the infrastructure that pays for it all, and that's trade. And that is a very accurate assessment of this country. We produce more domestically than we can ever consume. So we are therefore by definition a trade-based economy. 80% of our trade is with the United States. We are fools if we think that that will continue as a matter of given or certainty, given the turmoil politically in the United States with Trump, and even to an extent with Buy America First with Joe Biden. We are fools if we don't take advantage of our FFF export capacity to Europe and Asia. And we simply are signing our economic spiral assignment if we ignore those things. No business ever aligns its stability to one customer or certainty to one customer. In our case, our petroleum products, what is it, 87% goes to the United States? It's crazy. I mean, there are opportunities around the world, but we can't get stuff done in this country. So I say that on the focus to grow the economy, the budget is not stellar, but being an eternal optimist and of the view that advocacy is a marathon, never a sprint, the fact that there is reference to reducing supply chain vulnerabilities and reference to strengthening Canada's trade corridors, I'm hopeful that there will be a change in the 24 budget. Now, just to add to that, we are part of a coalition of 5 national business organizations, the Business Council of Canada, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Construction Association, Canada West Foundation, and Western Canada Road Builders, who are promoting and advocating for a national plan for trade corridor infrastructure, recognizing the investment return. In terms of dollar in, dollar out, for every dollar in, the country sees a return of anywhere from $1.30 to $1.90 same year as an ROI back to GDP, according to the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis, CANCEA. For every $1 million invested in trade infrastructure, there are 151 jobs, $7.5 million in wages, and $17 million of added trade spun off as a consequence or as a direct return on that $1 million across the country. So you can see why that is so important. And other countries, and I should say other country, recognize the perils of a weakened trade gateway and corridor system, and that's Biden's $1.3 trillion investment in trade gateways, corridors, bridges, structures to assure the American economy that it can continue to be a global trading participant. Mm-hmm. And that was a reaction to a 2-point drop in global reliability ratings by the World Economic Forum. We went from 9 to 32nd, and the silence has been deafening.
Thanks, everybody, for all your hard work. And if you want to see more of their hard work, we have a hub post which summarizes everything we've done over the past 2 or 3 days. So you can read about all this in more detail on the Daily Commercial News or on the Journal of Commerce websites. And check out our social media. All of us have been putting out all our articles throughout the week. So with that, thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Warren. Always a pleasure to be on the best construction podcast in the world.
Good day, Warren.